July 16th, 1852. We traveled through the Bear River Valley in the forenoon. This valley is one of great beauty, being covered with grass, with mountains behind, and before and on either side in plain view, with groves of fir trees nodding at their top, and even spots of snow visible in many places. This valley is tolerably fertile, and looks as if it might be well adapted to raising wheat. At 2:30, we came to two toll bridges building across a stream known as Thomas's Fork of the Bear River. They charged us $1 per wagon for crossing the two bridges. During the afternoon, our road was over the mountains, and they were quite slippery in consequence of light showers which fell at intervals during the day. We encamped near the Bear River and found good grass. The mosquitoes are troublesome in the extreme. We also passed 4 graves. Well, howdy, everyone, and welcome back to the Rancher Podcast. You just heard an excerpt from the diary of Miss Abigail Jane Scott, which I found on the Oregon Trail Center's website, recounting her experience with a river crossing on the trail near the terminus of the Oregon Trail in Oregon Territory in the 1850s. I'm really excited about getting back into these episodes. I apologize that there's been a little bit of time. I've been very busy. I attended the American Quarter Horses convention last month. I've also been traveling a bit for work. And just a small update on my life, I've also been applying to law school, so busy there. And on top of all of that, I've been honored with the appointment of becoming a trustee as one of the young adult at-large seats for the American Horse Council. So a lot going on in my life. On top of all of that, of course, it is rodeo season in full swing here in Texas. Rodeo Houston is going on. I've been volunteering at Rodeo Austin, so spending a lot of my weekends, especially Sundays, going out to Rodeo Austin to help get the livestock and competitive events set up. This past Sunday, I actually got to help with their Golden Stirrup Horse Show, which is a fantastic event that allows folks with special needs to compete in a horse show, and so really enjoyed doing that. Got to go to the rodeo Saturday night and plan on going a couple more times, but just wanted to say that, it's been a very busy time, very exciting time. I'm glad that rodeo is back. I'm glad that it's back in Texas, and I hope that all of you guys are making your plans to attend some rodeos coming up near you as well. So back to the account of Miss Abigail Jane Scott. This shows, of course, a river crossing that went extremely well. You had everything that you could possibly imagine to help you get across that river safely. You had experienced guides with ferries. There were apparently bridges being made, and this just shows that river crossings could be successful, and they could be turned into money-making opportunities for certain folks, and we'll learn a little bit more about that here in a minute. But if you have seen episode 4 of 1883, you know that the success depicted in this diary entry is not what happened to the Duttons, Captain Shea, and their immigrant wards. But I also wanted to bring up this river crossing story because of the description of the land. Again, this was actually in Oregon where this occurred, and it kind of gives you a good, accurate description of what these people would have heard, what these immigrants that were trying to move to Oregon would have known about, would have heard before they made the trip. Of course, back then there were no videos, there was nothing, maybe a little bit of grainy photography in black and white, but overall they really had to depend on word of mouth and diary entries and advertisements. And so this entry, which would have been 30 years before they made it out west in 1883, would have been something that they were probably looking at. And, again, the beautiful description, the idea that this would be a great place to grow some wheat, minus the giant mosquitoes, which of course still plague the Pacific Northwest and the Midwest of the United States to this day. it sounded like paradise. And so because of that, that is the paradise, the heaven that these people are willing to go through, the hell that is the great American desert, to pursue. So when you think about why these immigrants are pushing themselves through all of this to try and get there, you have to keep in mind that although they did not know where exactly they were going and how bad it would be to get there, they were driven forward by the promise of a better life. And the crew didn't have the luxury of a ferry or a bridge to pay a few dollars, and I'm sure they would have gladly paid 10 times that after what occurred on the Brazos River in episode 4. But it just goes to show that they were trying to get out to Oregon, to this beautiful country, and they were willing to take these risks, not only with their belongings but also their lives. So let's talk about the episode a little bit more and some real life examples of river crossings and other information from the episode right after a quick word from our sponsors. Well, I'm proud to welcome the newest sponsor for the Rancher podcast, and that is Elite Ranch Consulting. They are your one-stop shop for protecting your real estate investment. Whether you inherited a piece of land, bought a ranch as your vacation home, or are simply looking to maximize the land you are already working, Elite Ranch Consulting's team of experts can help you make the right decisions to make your land profitable. Visit EliteRanchConsulting.com today to learn more about how they can protect your American dream. Even if wagons were properly loaded, fording rivers was at best a risky endeavor. Wheels dropped into holes, causing wagons to overturn. Quicksand bogged wagons down, making it very difficult to pull out and perhaps causing them to capsize. Some of the crossings were of no particular significance. Most of the time, crossing was done simply by the teams and wagons being driven into the stream, and if the wagons had sufficient clearance, they crossed to the other side without harm. I found this small article from the Deseret News accounting for the Mormons and their path west into Utah and other areas such as Idaho and the rest of the West. But interestingly enough, it goes on to say that fording the generally narrow and sometimes deep rivers required ingenuity to get the wagon down the bank, into the water, and up the bank on the other side. The pioneers would use picks and shovels to cut down stream banks to get their wagons down the incline and into the water. Other times, men would gently ease a wagon down the steep slope by tying a long rope to the axle of the wagons. The pioneers, like other travelers on a trail, learned to angle their wagons as they crossed rivers to prevent the current from hitting the wagon broadside and possibly capsizing it. When sufficient timber was available, the pioneers also crossed river by building ferry boats. One of the most notable crossings was near Casper, Wyoming, where the pioneers crossed the North Platte River for the last time and would soon pick up the Sweetwater River. Fording the North Platte proved to be a more daunting task than the pioneers of 1847 had imagined. The brethren first unloaded all their wagons and began shipping across the river on their leather-skinned boat known as a revenue cutter. They proceeded to float the two wagons across the river while lashed together with ropes and poles. But when the wagons struck sand on the other side, the strong current rolled them over. On the next attempt, 4 wagons were lashed together, but this system did not work well. After several other attempts, it was decided to float 1 wagon at a time on a makeshift raft. This proved safe, but excruciatingly slow. Well, as I said, that account of the Mormon group's travel sounds much more like what happened in 1883 than Miss Abigail's in the beginning of the episode. Interestingly enough, another detail from the Deseret News that I learned was that after the Mormons had such difficulty in some of these rivers and they decided to start building settlements, they actually built different styles of transportation across rivers, and they would allow if you were a Mormon to cross for free, but could charge quite a bit actually for other folks. So again, back to that idea of the enterprising entrepreneurial spirit of the West. And when we talk about 1883 and we talk about the history behind it, I know sometimes it might seem like this show gets a bit dry, and sometimes history does, have just basic facts that aren't as interesting. But one of the most interesting and intriguing parts of the series is, of course, the fact that there's so much heartbreak that's played on screen. And, in this show that seems to just be an hours long tale of the heartbreak and the danger of life on a trail to the west in America, we experience kind of a new form of these trials, of these dangers in episode 4. Of course, the major objective was to cross the Brazos River. And this is a task that we've already discussed as being dangerous when I talked about all the things that could kill you on a trail in the last episode. But when you came to a trail, there were just too many different factors, too many variables for you to consider. And that's what really made them such a large danger. Because the current could be too strong, as we heard from the Deseret news article. The wheels of the wagons could get stuck in a soft bottom or in some ruts that you yourself created earlier. Your belongings could be ruined. The list goes on and on and on. And apparently that list also needs to include not being able to swim because it is illegal where you came from. And that brings us to another point of this episode and where it intersects with history that I wanted to bring up. I'm sure many of y'all are wondering, was swimming actually illegal in Germany? Did they actually whip the bodies? Well, according to ScreenRant, which is an online resource that talks about different shows and movies, this statement from Joseph, who was kind of the de facto leader of the immigrant group, could be considered only half a lie. Swimming was not actually banned countrywide. And of course, when we talk about countries, it gets a little interesting to even use that term with Germany and other European areas before, 1850. But swimming was not banned countrywide, but rather there were certain towns that had a high number of students, places with universities, and they would, from time to time, ban the students from swimming just to protect them. The Danube River, which is one of the major rivers that goes through Germany and Austria and much of Europe, was, seen as a somewhat dangerous river at the time. And in the 1500s, there was a rise in swimming deaths, and therefore the town of Ingolstadt actually banned swimming. And, for the part about the whipping, since this was related to school-aged children, I guess, of course, you had to whip them, right? That was the only way to teach students and school-aged students at that time. So they did, in fact, whip the bodies. But, this happened in the 1500s. So a solid 300 years beforehand. So, like I said at the beginning, did this happen? Yes. Did it happen in the 1800s? No. There's proven records that swimming was encouraged and taught and, a part of leisurely life by the mid-1800s. So kind of a funny thing. I'm sure it brought a lot of comedic relief to many people in the middle of an episode that was full of, a lot of angst and anguish. But, of course, Captain Shea's response is a great laugh line, and it just is kind of that whole traditional thing of like, it couldn't get any worse, could it? Oh, none of them know how to swim. So another thing that we see play out in this episode is the lightning of the wagons. And from a thematic perspective, we see that the bleak reality of the migration is setting in, right? The trail is stripping these people of everything that they own, everything that they are. Most importantly, it's stripping them of their identity. A lot of times in our modern society, if a home burns down or a natural disaster strikes, we'll say, it's just stuff, it can be replaced, don't worry about it, we've got your back, the community will support you. Uh, that was a lot harder to come to grips with when you're in the middle of quite literally nowhere. There's no supply store to buy something, even if you had the money. There was no insurance. There was nothing. There was no safety net. So it's a lot harder to think about in that way, because I think for my job requires a computer, right? If I bricked my computer today, it would be a momentary setback. Mostly, I could get back to work the next day. All I would need was a new computer. But you think about Captain Shea talking to the pianist, and what is a pianist without a piano? I mean, like he said, he doesn't know if there's pianos in Oregon. He might not be able to afford a new piano once he gets to Oregon. Like how do you make a living? What is a carpenter without his workshop, or a cowboy without his horse? I mean, these things, we might talk about them as part of an identity, but when you really think about it, they are what make us who we are. It's not necessarily a material thing. It's not being materialistic to need things for both survival, but also for making your livelihood. And I think you see that Captain Shea is trying to drive the point home that the pianist is not a pianist when you're on the trail. Your main role, your job, your occupation 24/7 is to survive the trail. And that is what is occurring here. These people are being stripped of all of the things that made them who they were in Germany, in Austria, and you're being stripped down to somebody who can survive on the trail. That is the main theme that I got out of this episode. And to see the household items, the things that make you feel civilized, sitting out in the middle of a barren desert country, it's hard to see. I mean, these people, they were dreaming of a new life, of course, and they knew that things were going to change, but they didn't really know exactly how much change was required. And of course, the climax of this episode is haunted by Elsa playing the now abandoned piano as the immigrants struggle to cross the river. We see people frantically try to ford this river. Some of them, of course, don't even make it. We see people get pulled off their horses trying to help. I mean, it's just utter chaos. And you think about just how difficult this had to be for them. You never knew what you were getting into, like I said, with a river. And the fact that you had people who were essentially helpless crossing it would have made it so much harder. And Elsa put it really clearly in the episode. She said that in an earlier episode, Behind Us a Cliff, she said that there's certain instances where a cliff arises or there's a no turning back moment. And, you have to think about this river and every river that they crossed as being one of those points. I mean, you literally just risked your entire life to get across this thing. There's no way you're going back. That is the point of no return. And you think about, from their perspective, of course, in the article about the Mormons' journey west, it talks about they would build rafts or ferries at certain points. There certainly wasn't any timber in this episode anywhere near the Brazos River, and you couldn't tow, of course, a boat with you preparing for in preparation for a river coming up. But it just would be so difficult to plan and so just nerve-wracking to think of. And while I don't have a good record on the number of folks who died crossing rivers on the trail, I've found some very interesting and honestly stunning numbers that around 3,500 people die in the United States each year from drowning. So just think about that. Today, with all the safety that we have, everything that we do, 3,500 people in the United States still die from that. So it is still a very clear and present danger, even to this day. And while the idea of drowning, obviously people always say you can drown in 3 inches of water. A lot of drownings occur in bathtubs or whatnot. The NIH report that I pulled this from actually indicates that rivers make up the largest shares of those deaths at around 26%. So rivers are inherently dangerous. And anyone who has swam in a river understands that it can be unsafe when you're just trying to go out and enjoy yourself if the water's moving too fast. But when you think about being weighed down by your belongings, your animals, children, the period clothing, all of these things, I mean, it must have been just absolutely a horror show, honestly. And I know that it's a constant theme that I touched on with this series, but it's apparent to anyone who watches the show that the easy days on a trail were the ones where you woke up at dawn and pushed forward as hard as you could until dusk, and just the welcomed monotony of pushing as far forward as you could without any problems. But the bad days, the hard days, the ones when the thieves, the weather, the wildlife, disease, all of these things were trying to kill you, they made this journey the hard thing that it was. And so when you watch this episode, and you might think, well, I could have gotten across that river no problem or whatnot, but just try and imagine being someone a world away. I always think whenever I watch shows in other parts of the world, I'm like, I have no idea what is in that water. I don't want to know what's in that water, much less the currents, all of those kinds of things. So it really puts into perspective just how scary and how unknown a river crossing could be. The last thing I wanted to touch on was actually plugging a book that my father-in-law told me about that gives you an in-depth look at the Brazos River, specifically the section that runs through central Texas. And that's the river that our group in episode 4 crosses. So if you're interested in more about the Brazos, of course, I went to A&M, and the Brazos runs not too far from campus, and it actually runs essentially through Baylor University's campus. So it's a very iconic and recognizable river to most Texans. But there's a great book called Goodbye to a River by John Graves that was actually published in 1960, and it details a trip